Hello, everyone. My name is Shaylin Ameo, and I am the Public Engagement Manager for Connecticut Landmarks. I will be your moderator today. We are using the webinar setup of Zoom, so you do not need to worry about muting yourself or turning your camera off. If you would like to submit a question for our speaker, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of your window. If you need assistance, you can select my name, CTL Shaylin, in the chat feature. Connecticut Landmarks is a statewide network of historic house museums that shares 400 years of New England history. You can see some of those houses on your screen now. We use our historic properties to inspire an understanding of our complex past to help create a state whose people move forward together as one. Today's program is part of our Landmarks Lunch and Learn virtual lecture series, presented the second Wednesday of each month, June through November at noon. This series helps you make deeper connections to the history of our people, buildings, and landscapes. To see the full lineup on our website, ctlandmarks.org, or follow the link that I am about to drop in the chat. Today's program focuses on the Palmer Warner House, located in East Haddam. Built by John and Mehitable Warner in 1738, the property was last owned and occupied by Frederic Palmer and Howard Metzger, a gay couple who lived, worked, and cared for the house and its 50 acres of land. They entertained family and friends, cooked elaborate meals, collected antiques, records, and cars, coaxed topiary out of the gardens, and created a space for themselves on the property in an area that Frederic Palmer referred to as the, quote, wilds of Connecticut. We are glad to gather with you in June, which is now celebrated as Pride Month, to discuss LGBTQ+ history. However, as Palmer and Metzger's relationship spanned 1945 to Palmer's death in 1971, we acknowledge that they would not have celebrated, nor likely even imagined, Pride in an era before the Stonewall Uprising. We also acknowledge that the struggle towards freedom is long and the work is not done, and we look to a future where all people are able to live their lives fully as themselves without fear. The Palmer Warner House connects visitors to 20th century LGBTQ history and deepens understandings of the development, impacts, and legacies of the historic preservation field through the home of Frederic Palmer and Howard Metzger. Through this work, we hope to develop a deeper understanding of and connection to the experiences and communities of the past in order to build a more just future. And now, I'd like to introduce and welcome today's speaker. Bridget Pupillo is an adjunct professor at Connecticut College and a freelance translator. She will be discussing her recent project translating the Italian language letters of Frederic Palmer and partners from his time in Europe in the 1930s. Without further ado, I will stop my screen share so that Bridget can have the floor.
All right, thank you everyone so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you, and I wanted to give a special thanks as well to my friends at Connecticut Landmarks, Erin, Shaylin, and Jocelyn, who invited me here to speak today. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to share my experience working with Connecticut Landmarks on this fantastic project, especially during Pride Month. So I am going to now share my screen with you. There we go. I'm hoping that's visible. Perfect. All right. So when Erin first approached me with this translation project, I immediately jumped at the opportunity because it was so very different from anything I had ever done before. The project was monumental. My work spanned from January to October of 2022, and it involved the transcription and translation of over 100 letters, postcards, magazine clippings, wedding and birth announcements. The project challenged me to use new techniques and learn new technology as well. I learned to use voice-to-text technology to transcribe these letters into a more workable digital format for translation. Because remember, the majority of these letters were written in the 1930s in pen and ink with scrawly penmanship and odd letter styles and questionable spelling. Half the battle was trying to figure out what the letter writer was trying to say in Italian and then translate it into English. I found that the easiest and quickest method was to read each letter aloud into a voice-to-text program, which would transcribe my spoken words. I'd then go through and make corrections, and finally, I would translate the letter into English. Another challenge for all of us throughout this project was the fact that we didn't quite know what to expect from these letters. They had been discovered, bundled together, once the Palmer-Warner House came into the custody of Connecticut Landmarks. We knew that they represented correspondences between Frederic Palmer, the main protagonist of our story and the owner of the Palmer-Warner House, and two Italian men from the small ski resort town of Cortina d'Ampezzo in the Dolomite mountain range, kind of near the Austrian border. Based on prior information about Frederic Palmer's life, we had reason to believe that his relationship with these two men might have been of a romantic nature. Walking into a large project with little information to go on, it was very easy to create one's own assumptions, to speculate about these characters and their lives, their actions, their motivations. As the story unfolded with each new translated letter, I found those assumptions confirmed at times and then completely blown out of the water at other times. It was a humbling experience of self-reflection on the role and influence of the translator when telling the story of real lives, complicated, emotionally and financially driven, but completely human lives. At this point, I would like to introduce you to the characters in our epistolary saga. Who were they? How did they meet? Why did they continue to correspond for years, even decades? The story is fascinating and has more twists and turns than a daytime soap opera, so I hope you're ready. First, our protagonist, Frederic Palmer. Here he is, looking quite dapper in his top hat and his cane. So he was born in 1901 in Montville to a manufacturing family of some means. And Frederic spent a good deal of time traveling in Europe with his beloved mother, Mary Brennan Palmer, on a grand tour of sorts. So this is Mary, and this is her with their cat, Nero. During the time documented in these letters, Palmer and his mother traveled extensively throughout Italy, to Paris, to Germany, to Majorca in Spain, to Greece, even to Austria. In between these extensive tours, Frederic managed to spend some time back in the States, first rooming with a friend from his Harvard days, where he received his architectural degree, and then moving from Cambridge to New London, Connecticut, and eventually settling into the house which he and his mother purchased in 1936, now the Palmer-Warner House and Museum in East Haddam. Throughout all these many travels and residences, Frederic made it quite clear that his heart lay in the craggy mountain peaks of northeastern Italy, and he found excuses to return there time and again. It was during his first stay in Cortina that we met our second character, Franz Siorpaes. So here we are. This is Franz. He was a dashing young handyman and woodworker from at the magnificent Hotel Cristallo, the premier ski resort in the town of Cortina. And this is a photo from one of Frederic Palmer's albums of the Cristallo Hotel. Over the span of time documented in our letters, Franz worked his way up to maitre d' at the hotel, and he seems to do quite well for himself, both in terms of his career and in the realm of romantic interludes. In our early correspondences, we find that Franz gushes with love for Frederic, who goes by the name of Fritz in his letters. And in the next line, he talks about his on and off relationship with Maria. So here he says, "No, dear Fritz, I have not forgotten. It is not easy to forget a person you love so, so much. And please do not say to me, out of sight, out of mind again. It's not true. I always remember you, and many times a day I think, what is my Fritz doing? He's so far away and he will be having a lot of fun. My fling with Maria is only going so-so. I don't even know how to explain it to you. Franz to Frederic, October 12th, 1932. Frederic takes a similar but even more reserved attitude in his letters. He proclaims his love in poetic tones, but he quickly moves on to more utilitarian matters. He wants Franz to commission a hand-knitted alpine sweater for him. What should I do here alone without my dearest companion of love and pain? In any case, I want to ask you if you can find someone for me, your mother or Guida, for example, who would make me one similar to yours in blue. It's this one that's short. It comes right to the waist, no? Of course, I will pay for the wool and the work. How much will it cost with that heavier wool and the same kind of stuff as your blue one? I'll tell you the color and you can find someone to do it. Frederic to Franz, October 14th, 1932. And then again, a week later, my dear, if I could come into your arms and feel the kisses of your sweet mouth, I'd believe I was in paradise, and it would be for me. And for you? Yes, the sportswear is made from the same fabric as the swatch, and Mom started the wool socks like the swatch I sent yesterday. Frederic to Franz, October 23rd, 1932. So from these letters, it's clear that Frederic and Franz enjoyed each other's company when together, but they also have separate lives and separate agendas. They spend much of their time bickering and overreacting when a response doesn't arrive promptly, and then apologizing and making up when the letter finally arrives with excuses for its tardiness. Franz also proclaims jealousy over Frederic's imagined or real affairs, all the while continuing to have affairs of his own on the side. Here, Franz says, you must be very angry with me because I have written you 2 letters and 6 postcards, and you have not yet replied to me. Why, my dear Fritz? Are you mad at me? I don't know why. I think you've not received my correspondence. At least one postcard with greetings I was expecting from you these past days, but nothing. Why all this silence, dear friend? Did you perhaps find a girlfriend on your travels or another male friend? Look, Fritz, I'm jealous over you. Don't do this to me. Franz to Frederic, November 16th, 1932. And Frederic, with his own apology after a furious letter demanding to know why Franz hadn't written. Dear little meanie, I liked your express letter so much, especially seeing that you love me enough to send it express. As I said yesterday, my letter on the 31st was perhaps a bit mean, but you must forgive me because I suffered so much in my heart without your letters, as I didn't know if you were just being mean or if you were sick. The first is nothing, but the second is very important. Frederic to Franz, November 3rd, 1932. The relationship between Franz and Frederic seems to be one of manufactured crises, of attempts to create drama in order to spice up a romance that in fact is more a matter of convenience than anything else. Frederic is kind and patronizing. He sends small gifts and writes sweet nothings to Franz, but he also uses this Italian contact to have photographs developed and shipped, to have sweaters custom made, and even to receive ski lessons. Franz, for his own part, proclaims his love, but in truth, he seems most interested in having fun, going out drinking, dancing, skiing with friends, going to the cinema. His forbidden relationship with a well-to-do American tourist is just part of the fun. Let me pause for a moment to mention some interesting aspects of the translation of these letters between Franz and Frederic. First, you will notice that we have correspondences from both parties. We have letters from Franz to Frederic, but also from Frederic to Franz. This is an unusual and very fortunate circumstance for a bundle of letters found in an individual's home. We would expect to have only the letters Frederic received, not the ones he sent out. But Frederic was nothing if not thorough in his self-archiving. Because his Italian was rudimentary at best, he wrote out complete drafts of his letters, spending painstaking hours hunched over a dictionary to find the words he did not know, crossing out and rewriting sections, self-editing his every word before writing another final draft to be sent in the post. Can you imagine the amount of time spent on such an endeavor? His letters were long, handwritten, and often sent only days apart. It is a remarkable feat. And it speaks to his commitment to this epistolary relationship, no matter the motives. It also offers us a unique opportunity to read both sides of the story without having to fill in the gaps or guess at one letter writer's responses. One significant challenge for me as a translator is to read and retell this relationship without injecting my own judgments into the narrative. This is difficult. How do I capture just the right tone? How do I account for the passionate sentiments followed by utilitarian instructions on the purchase of wool? Will my like or dislike of certain aspects of their personalities alter the way in which an English speaker reads the translated texts? These were all questions with which I had to contend as I worked on this project, and it was about to get much, much worse. The relationship between Frederic and Franz shifted dramatically when Frederic returned to Cortina and the Hotel Cristallo for a visit over the Christmas holidays in late 1932. It was meant to be a joyous reunion of these two would-be lovers, and all went well for a few days until a third character entered the mix. Meet Fritz Walpoth, our third correspondent. Tall, blue-eyed and fair, more Germanic than Italian, Fritz was a boarder in the home of Franz's parents. Unlike Franz, who was an entrepreneurial go-getter at the hotel, Fritz was a man of very little means, working in a print shop in town and eking out his daily existence. Quite different from the happy-go-lucky, gregarious Franz, Fritz was solitary, moody, prone to bouts of depression. In other words, he was Frederic's ideal type. The two met by chance when Franz invited both of them on a ski trip to Pokol, a nearby mountain village. And this is a slide showing the group that went on this ski adventure. They stayed together in a rustic lodge, and Frederic shared a bed with Fritz. It was love at first sight for Frederic, and that night would become almost mythical for him. He would return often to memories of their short time together. Here, Frederic says, "All day my thoughts are of you, and every night I imagine we are falling asleep together. I remember how sweet you were, always so sweet with me, and how I rested on that right arm, and with that hand, the one you injured, around my neck. Ah, how happy I was when I could be with you. You don't understand how much you mean to me." Frederic to Fritz, February 18th, 1933. Frederic's utilitarian relationship with Franz quickly fell to the wayside as he was consumed with his feelings for Fritz Walpoth. We notice that his draft letters to Franz end abruptly at this point. He continues to receive letters from Franz, which reference a continued correspondence, but he no longer feels the need to expend the effort of writing and meticulously editing his drafts. From this point forward, we only see one side of the story, the side of Franz. And on that side, we see increasing desperation to recapture Frederic's attention. Frederic is well aware that Fritz has taken his place in his American friend's heart, and he is none too happy about it. In fact, he goes so far as to claim that he has met a wealthy older gentleman who will be whisking him off on a European getaway, all in an attempt to revive Frederic's feelings for him. Here he says, "It is very likely, dear Fritz, that I will be leaving for France this spring with a good and kind gentleman. He is very nice. He has helped me a lot so that I can leave my family in good stead for 3 years and go to see the world." Franz to Frederic, February 23rd, 1933. We learn in the next letter that it was all just an elaborate hoax, just to see if you still love me and if you still think of your faithful friend who is so far from you. With pleasure, I saw that you would have been really upset. Now I feel at ease and I know that you still love me, Franz says on March 1st. This seems to be the point of no return for Frederic. The letters he receives from Franz become sparse and a bit curt, with noted irritation over Frederic's lack of response. In other words, Franz and his immature acts of deception seem to fade out of Frederic's life. Now is the moment for Fritz Walpoth to take the stage as the star player. And this is an image of Frederic and Fritz together. Fritz is a complex character, one who evades simple categorization. He seems to be one thing, and then he reveals himself to be something quite different. Crucial information about his personality and activities slowly trickles out from the correspondence in such a way that it leaves the reader hanging, never knowing what to expect next. And I admit, this is where my role as an objective translator became really, really difficult. We begin with a long silence from Fritz, and Frederic sending him many letters, beseeching him to respond, running the gamut from angry and betrayed to genuinely concerned. Finally, Frederic does receive a letter from Fritz, and we learn that Fritz has been suffering with a terrible toothache, which will require significant dental work and a large sum of money, 1,000 lire, a huge amount for that time. With this news begins a trend we find throughout the relationship between Frederic and Fritz. Fritz writes with terrible news of being gravely ill, injured, losing his job, losing his rooming accommodation. Next comes the plea for Frederic to send money and save him from destitution. Here's how it begins in Fritz's first letter. I have to have my teeth fixed, otherwise I will have to have an operation and it will cost me much more. So write me what I should do. I hope, dear Fritz, and remember Fritz is what Frederic refers to himself as in these letters. So I hope, dear Fritz, that you are generous and able to help me a little, otherwise I'm lost. Fritz to Frederic, January 11th, 1933. Underlying this request is a basic assumption shared by both the Italians, Fritz and Franz. They assume that Frederic is a wealthy American touring the world with his mother, staying in luxury hotels, vacationing for months at a time without having to work. He could and should help out someone much less fortunate like Fritz, whom he claims to love. I admit, I had the same thought. Why doesn't Frederic just pay this guy's dental bill and out of kindness? The truth is a bit more complicated. Frederic tries to explain to Fritz that his financial situation is not as lucrative as it might seem, and besides, the money belongs to his mother, not to him. Money is also difficult at the moment. Franz cannot understand that I do not have a large amount of money, but I hope you can. When I'm traveling with Mom, it's very hard to get some to send to you. But if you have a great need, my brother, I will try to send a little. Frederic to Fritz, January 18th, 1933. We also sense a bit of wariness in Frederic's response. What is the real motivation here? Does Fritz truly return his affections, or does he intend to use Frederic as a sugar daddy? I have to admit, I immediately shared Frederic's sense of wariness, and perhaps with good reason. Fritz's requests for money begin in this coy, polite way, but as time goes on, they become more and more insistent, and they seem to include a heaping dose of emotional blackmail. On June 25th, 1933, after more than a month of silence, Frederic receives a dark letter from Fritz, claiming that he has lost his job at the print shop and he will be begging for bread. He even goes so far as to insinuate suicide. What is left for me? Nothing. I will end up like a ragamuffin, going from door to door and begging for some bread. Fritz, I have nothing else left to do. I have no more money to go somewhere and ask for work. And write? I have already written, but everywhere they say they are very sorry, so there's nothing left to do but ... Fritz, this is a last cry for help. You surely know many gentlemen. If you, my Fritz, really love me, if you love your mother, I beseech you to beg on your knees. Ask those gentlemen for a small charity for me. Ask your friends, do this kindness for me. Maybe I will find something from time to time. Or do you want, as my good brother, to let me starve? Fritz, if you do this, you will no longer have good fortune in your life. My heart will always be with you, even if you no longer want me, but do not leave me without bread. Fritz to Frederic, June 25th, 1933. Yet we also find that when Frederic does find a way to send money to Fritz, for example, so that Fritz could take a trip to visit his long estranged mother who lives in the city of Bolzano, Fritz later admits that he hasn't actually spent the funds as they were intended, but instead used them for clothing or even ski trips. At this point, I have to pause and say that I, as an uninvited guest peering into this relationship, had very uncharitable feelings toward both Fritz and Frederic. I couldn't help but feel that Fritz was a mooch and an opportunist, toying with Frederic's affections for financial gain, only writing when he needed something from his American friend. I started to doubt his stories, which seemed to become more far-fetched and extreme by the day. I found myself scoffing and rolling my eyes as I translated his words, despite my duty to relate their truth and not inject my own feelings into their meaning. Frederic likewise had begun to irritate me. He seemed naive, believing every sob story, every carefully placed declaration of love, and though he did not send money at every request, he did continue this epistolary relationship, and he did send clothing and gifts, and yes, sometimes money. I wanted to take him by the shoulders and shake him, tell him to open his eyes and see what was really going on here. But in actuality, I knew no more of the real truth than anyone else. One of the struggles of reconstructing a whole life from an epistolary exchange is that so much of it must necessarily be fictionalized. First, we don't know how accurate or truthful the letters themselves are. Did Fritz actually fall down and break his hand in a ski accident? Did he truly lose his job? How bad was his living situation? And what about Frederic? Why did he continue to engage in this lopsided relationship? Was he truly so lonely and naive, or did he know what he'd gotten himself into and a part of him enjoyed this uneven dynamic? And what was happening in all the time in between the letters? We don't know, so we begin to imagine. We begin to judge. We begin to flatten and dehumanize these incredibly complex characters whom we only know from photo albums and words on a written page. Despite my misgivings about Fritz and his financial motivations, I had to admit to myself that this relationship with Frederic, whatever it might have been, was long. It stretched over decades and documented many unexpected transitions and evolutions in both of their lives. Frederic, of course, moved back to the States. He worked as an architect. He was laid off during the Great Depression. He bought the Palmer Warner house with his mother. He lost his mother. He found the love of his life in the American sailor Howard Metzger, and he settled into a happy existence in East Haddam, puttering around with his Rolls-Royce cars and collecting an overwhelming amount of bric-a-brac for their historic home. Fritz, on the other hand, failed in his attempt to start an organized collective to run the print shop. He had a falling out with his mother, with whom he always had a difficult relationship. She left their home and took all the furniture, leaving him to sit in an empty shell. His depression deepened over the years, and he found solace in the mountains and in his Catholic faith. But eventually, things did seem to make a positive turn for him. We learn quite out of the blue that Fritz is an international bobsled champion. He sends along a clipping titled, "The Tennis Club Cristallo crew of HBC Cortina wins the four-man championship." As the article gushes about his team, contrary to general predictions, they managed not only to beat the previous record, but to score an amazing time of 1 minute 17 and a fifth seconds, which, according to expert authorities, will not easily be beaten in the future. Fritz even makes it to the World Championships in Germany with his bobsledding team. In other surprising news, Fritz announces in a letter dated August 1st, 1937, that he is engaged to be married, and he asks Frederic to be the best man in his wedding. He paints his new fiancée, aptly named Speranza, or Hope, in loving, almost angelic tones. Up till now, we have never argued. She is very kind and loves me so much. I hope you won't be against it because she's 3 years older than me, but she looks 5 years younger. She is very kind, frugal, healthy, and strong. When she read your letter that war is likely coming, she cried a lot. She said you were mean to say things like that. She doesn't want me to go to war. You know, Fritz, sometimes when she speaks, she seems like a child because she's a little shy, and I'm the first man she has ever loved. Fritz to Frederic, August 1st, 1937. For the first time in all of their correspondence, Fritz seems genuinely happy. We start to understand the extreme depths of his loneliness, which likely clouded all other aspects of his behavior and his life. We can see the true Fritz now that the clouds have lifted. He writes several more times about his new wife, always portraying her as an angel come to earth, the kindest and sweetest person he could ever have met. Not only has he gained a partner, but an entire family, one which he had sorely lacked growing up. His in-laws have taken him in as their own son, and he finally feels at ease and bolstered with support. It is a wonderful moment in their correspondence, but one that is tragically short-lived. Fritz admits to Frederic that they have no real desire to have children. They want to wait until the money is not so tight. They worry about bringing children into a world shattered by war. Remember, this is 1937 when Italy had joined the Axis with Germany and Japan, and Germany is about to annex Austria, just miles from across the border from Fritz's hometown. One also wonders if Fritz's ambiguous sexual orientation and Speranza's noted innocence might have played a role in this decision as well. However, as often happens in Italian families, the larger family's desires prevailed. They want grandchildren and they don't want to wait. And so, dutifully, Fritz and Speranza start a family. Speranza's first pregnancy is with twins, and while Fritz frets and worries, she glows with happiness and calm, awaiting her new babies. However, as Fritz relates in a shocking letter from January 1940, things take a turn. Complications arise in the pregnancy, and Speranza has to be admitted to hospital in the city of Belluno. The doctors assure Fritz everything will be fine, and they tell him to return home. Even Speranza tells him that he worries too much, and she assures him all will be well. He kisses her goodbye and returns home by train. The next paragraph is a gut punch. On Sunday, I went to Holy Communion and prayed to God that everything would be okay. I cried and prayed a lot. On Monday at 9, the parish priest called me and told me that my joy, my life, everything that was dear to me, everything I lived for was no more. My most beloved angel was no more. She had passed away and left me alone with 2 children without their mommy. Fritz, my friend, the day before yesterday, I was given the news that one of the babies has died. Its mother took it with her. She did not want to be alone without me. And so she took the little angel that I had given the name Gastone Speranza, and I am left with Umberto Federico. Fritzi, I was in Belluno yesterday. The little one is still in the hospital because he's a little behind, but he's so beautiful and is doing well. I hope that I can at least keep this little being, that fruit of my beloved little mother. Fritz, you can't imagine how much suffering. I brought my wife to Belluno on Saturday, full of joy to see her soon, and on Tuesday, I came back to find her dead, January 7th, 1940. Here it feels as if reality and fiction have finally coalesced into fully tragic form. All our assumptions, all our irritable judgments about the nature of these characters, all the cajoling for money, all the petty bickering over long-awaited letters, they all slip away as we sit with the heavy horror of this unimaginable but exquisitely real situation. Fritz has lost the only source of happiness and stability in his difficult life. Speranza, his hope, is gone, and along with her, the family who took him in, one of his newborn babies as well. He is left to care for his son, premature, motherless, brought into a world of war and uncertainty. We can only imagine what Fritz is enduring as he looks upon this new life and says goodbye to his wife and daughter. For all the twists and turns of this long epistolary exchange that reads like a novel, even the worst moments could not have prepared us for this tear-jerking climax. And climax it is. This is the last real letter we have from Fritz. We have one more short note dated a decade later in 1950, where Fritz claims to have written several times without receiving any response. He sends an update that he and his now 10-year-old son are both doing well. We have no details as to their living situation or of Fritz's recovery from his great loss. But then, in one final chapter of this story, we are left to dream of brighter horizons. We find the formal birth announcement of a daughter, Maria Clara, to Fritz and Ines Walpoth on April 15th, 1954, 14 years after that tragic moment of loss, and nearly 9 years after the end of World War II. Like Frederic, we're left to fill in all the many gaps over these past 14 years, but we see with surprise that Fritz has once again found his hope for happiness, for the future, for family, for love. And despite their long and unexplained estrangement, he still feels the need to share this moment of joy with his American friend of years past. One last surprise. Our story does not end with the narrative voice of Fritz, but with a return to Frederic, whose voice had gone silent all the way back in 1933 when he stopped keeping drafts of his letters to Fritz. Here, though, he makes a concerted effort to draft one last letter to his old and dear friend Fritz. I will read the short letter in full. December 13th, 1954. Dearest Fritz, lovely wishes for Christmas and the New Year. You are married again. I am glad that you don't have to live alone. It is good that you have a woman to watch over you while you, like me, begin to grow old. And congratulations on your little girl. After so many years, you have found the courage to become a dad again. But are you sure that you're still a man? When will you ever send me a photograph of you and your son? He must be a big young man now. We are doing well as always. I still work in architecture. In my free time, I enjoy collecting old cars. The brand is Rolls-Royce. Many more dear greetings, your F. How difficult it is for me to write in this language now. Difficult indeed. This language, Italian, is from another world, another lifetime. And yet that world still lingers, hanging silently over the past and future. How do we translate this long and tortuous story into our own terms? How do we bridge this distance? How do we make sense of the complexities of life for three young men engaged physically and emotionally with one another under the ever-watchful gaze of Mussolini's Italy and a less than tolerant post-depression America? How do we count for their foibles, their inexplicable decisions, their almost fictional world of ski resorts and broken teeth and bobsled championships, their perplexing but absolutely real humanity? All I can say is this: we feel less distant when we read their letters. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just going to do a little bit of quick housekeeping. Okay, thank you so much for that incredible overview of this roller coaster of a project. I know I loved hearing about your work. We do have a couple of questions. If anyone listening has any questions, they can drop them into the Q&A feature down at the bottom or send them to me through the chat if that's easier. But first, let's get to the questions that I already have. So just to kind of zoom way back, can you talk a little bit about how you came to translation work in general? I think it's such a fascinating job to have, it's a fascinating project to take on. So I was hoping you could share a little bit about your own journey there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, much like this project, I sort of fell into it by happenstance. So I was doing my PhD in Italian. I actually have a doctorate in medieval Italian literature. And someone asked me to translate something to do with their taxes, just, as a friend. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I did. And I thought, it's kind of satisfying. And then friends started asking me, hey, do you mind translating this article that I wrote? I'd like to publish it in English. I'll pay you for it. And it just sort of developed from there and took on a life of its own. And just recently, in the last 2 years, I decided to make it more of a full-time career. So I had been working in a library position, but decided that I was going to make a go of the translation. And it's been very productive and a really positive move for me.
That is so fascinating. I love hearing how people end up in these cool roles, right? And I guess like in this project and in other projects, are there any concepts in Italian that you find particularly challenging to translate into English? And so that might be something specific, or it could just be broader, or vice versa, like things that are common in English that are hard to bring back over if you do it the other way.
There are definitely some idiomatic expressions that are kind of hard to, you have to come up with something else that sort of fits, but it's not quite the same. But I would say that actually the biggest challenge in this was that it seemed that 2 out of the 3 writers were not native Italian speakers, which is kind of interesting. So we automatically know that Frederic spoke English as his native language, and he was trying hard in Italian, but many times he would choose the wrong word, or it didn't make grammatical sense, and I had to sort of figure out what he was trying to say. But the same was actually true of Fritz Walpoth as well. He seemed to have been a native German speaker, which was not that uncommon for that area of Italy, which up until World War I had been part of Austria. So, he was probably raised speaking German, and Italian was his second language. And so there were similar kind of struggles, strange spellings. He'd just throw German in every once in a while.
Oh no.
So it was a bit of a challenge in that respect.
I believe it. That sounds, I mean, as somebody who only speaks English, that sounds very challenging. And so one of the things, and I think this came through a little bit as you were referencing some of the images that come from scrapbooks that are in CTL's collections, right? So the images were from Frederic's scrapbooks that he assembled. Do you find it helpful to have access to items in the archive? Does that help you kind of build out your image of the people? And if so, what kinds of archival materials do you like to be able to see?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think in this case in particular, it was absolutely necessary for me to have a better feel of these people, these people who existed in real life. They weren't just fictional characters. They had lives and very, very elaborate and complex lives. And so one of the things that was very, very helpful for me was to make a visit to the Palmer Warner house and see how Frederic, there it is, and to see how he actually lived here in the US. Obviously, I couldn't make the trip to Cortina to see the Cristallo, which does still exist. That hotel does still exist. It's quite different now. But at least I could see his lives and some of the material objects that he felt were important, but also having access to the photo albums. That was an immense help because I didn't have access until much later in the project. So I had formed an image in my head of these 3 characters, and seeing them in person, they were quite different than what I had expected. So I almost wish that I had seen them right from the start. So I had that image in my head, almost like reading a novel and then watching the movie later and being disappointed that they don't look right.
Yes.
It was a little bit like that. Yeah. So
I was just talking to somebody about that with radio personalities, about how you imagine what they look like based on their voice, and then all of a sudden you see them and you have to kind of reshuffle everything. So I totally understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with this sort of project, which I will admit was kind of unique for me, it's not the typical academic work that I do. I think it was so fundamental to have access to the archives, and I would highly encourage anyone else who's interested in this story to make the visit and to actually see and get a feel for these real lives.
Yes, and we would love to have them. I suppose that's my opportunity to plug a visit to the Palmer Warner House. Located in East Haddam, the house is open for tours by appointment. So go to our website, ctlandmarks.org. We would love to see you and show you the wonderful and intriguing space that Frederic Palmer and all of the people who lived with him at the house, including Howard Metzger, curated there. And so then I did have another question, and this might I don't know how this is gonna go. So I think this came through a little bit in your talk, but when you are in the thick of a project like this, do you ever find that the folks whose work you're translating kind of comes through to you? So does it ever impact your speech or your writing style? Do you ever think in the sort of in the style of the letter writers? And you did talk a little bit about this, like, do your feelings ever impact the way that you translate things? Because I know translation can be like a little bit of it's more of an art than a science. Okay.
Yes. So let me unpack that because
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. So one of the things, and this is not exactly answering your question, but one of the things that I had to grapple with in this project was the penmanship, right? So when I first saw the letters, I was a little scared because they were really hard to read. And there's certain people who had, very different styles of handwriting. I think the most difficult for me was Fritz Walpoth. His was really scratchy and really hard to read. But as I continued with the project, I got to know what the letters meant, what their writing style was, and I could read it so much easier as it went along, and that was sort of satisfying to me, almost like I had gotten into their heads a little bit, like, oh, I know what this is going to be. That letter's a P because I've seen it 50 times before. So that was kind of fun to feel like I was sort of being immersed a little bit into their world and understanding them a little bit better just by their writing styles. In terms of getting into a project and feeling like it kind of consumes you in the way that perhaps an actor feels when they take on a character. Yes, I do think that this happens, particularly with characters who are so vibrant, right? And they have very distinct and large personalities. It's hard not to take on a little bit of that. Maybe start using some of their funny language or their, idiomatic expressions in your own life, or just imagining yourself in the 1930s on a ski trip. That absolutely happened. But like you brought up towards the end of your question, I also had to attempt to maintain some sort of lack of bias, and that was very hard in this whole project, because I did feel myself getting very close to these characters for all of their good and bad. And so yes, I hope that I did justice to the letters as a sort of unbiased observer, but I do think that there were probably a few times where I might have put some sort of nuanced, feel to the words that I couldn't help myself. So hopefully not too much.
I think we'll forgive you. I think we all of us who have worked with the Palmer Warner House or with any of our other historic houses can completely relate to that. It's so hard not to kind of inject your own feelings when you're in people's archives, when you're in people's homes. It's just kind of baked into the process. So I think we've gone through our questions for today, but if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to send us an email. I'll make sure to connect you with Bridget, and we can make sure that those beautiful connections happen. But I want to thank you yet again, Bridget. This was fantastic. I really appreciate your insight into this process and sharing this project that so clearly was close to your heart, and we are so grateful to be able to build on your work as we continue the interpretation process at the Palmer Warner House. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaylin, and to everyone at the Palmer Warner House. Wonderful.
All right. Well, that concludes today's Landmarks Lunch and Learn. But I hope that we will see everyone soon at the house and virtually as well for next month's program.